the joys of, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine.
Anthony, the first question I'd like to ask you, and this is a question that has come up increasingly in the recent years, and your book, My Israel Question, is a huge part of this, which is that there is a growing pro-Palestine voice in the USA, right? And in the USA is where it's really important. And there's the International Solidarity Movement, J Street, Open Letter and Tikkun magazine to Obama by Rabbi Michael Lerner. To what extent do you see this voice countering the Zionist lobby that's operating there?
I think it's really important that we have in America and much of the West a challenging of a very hardline Zionist perspective. One of the ironies often is that what Israel has been doing for decades, supported by many Western countries, Australia, America, much of the West,
right,
and often India too,
right,
is actually made, the Western policy is a two-state solution,
right,
so they say.
right.
The truth is, though, that continued colonisation and building settlements in the West Bank has made that actually impossible in a viable way.
Right.
So to have alternative perspectives in America from Palestinians, from Jews, from concerned citizens, because ultimately America is the biggest provider of foreign aid every year to Israel. It's $3 billion plus, weapons, etc. And in the last 5 years or so, there's a growing, it's a minority, it's not a majority, but it's a growing minority of Jews who are doing two things. One, increasingly critical of Israeli behaviour, comparing it to apartheid in South Africa, which is an appropriate comparison. But secondly, which is what the Zionist lobby worries, that increasing numbers of young Jews simply don't care.
Right.
So if you fast forward 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, where's the support for Israel going to come from? It's going to come from two sectors: Orthodox Jews, often who are crazy, or religious Christian fundamentalists who are crazy too. So in some ways you could say, someone like me, I mean, I'm Jewish, but I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. I don't believe that Israel should be a Jewish state. I'm encouraged by that, these different voices, but where it's going to lead to politically, I don't know. At the moment, the position of the US government under Obama is no different really to the former administration, and Israel is allowed to get away with murder. So unless these voices get more power in America and elsewhere, things are unlikely to change that much. But I'm sort of optimistic, a little.
What about the Jews in Israel? Is there any dissent coming in from there, from inside the country, saying, is there any section of the media out there who are saying that, okay, look, this is wrong?
Yeah. Yes, but not nearly enough. Right. The Israeli left, if you call it that, the peace movement, the progressive movement, for many, many years has been weak to the point of non-existence. Of course, there are Israeli Jews who don't like what's going on, but they have little political power. Right. In the last sort of year or so, there's a slight spurt of Israeli Jews who are speaking out and being critical, mainly because the Israeli government has become so right-wing and so quasi-fascist that they embrace the most vile, racist, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian behaviour. And ultimately, I think for many Jews, they are fundamentally upset with the fact that Judaism has now been defined by Israeli crimes. And I think ultimately, though, if you speak to many Israeli Jews in Israel, they will say, without outside pressure, though, this is not going to change. So there's not enough Israeli Jews who realise or accept what they're doing is wrong. Because ultimately, if Americans keep on supporting it, why would you stop it? Right. Apart from the fact that it's wrong and it's illegal and it's terrible, why would you stop it? So yes, there are Jews in Israel, but we need far more.
Right. One of the reasons I asked you this question is because, I mean, there are a lot of people among the Indian media who are raising quite raising their voices about Kashmir, right, in India. Now, do you think a lot of people draw parallels between what's happening with Palestine and what's happening with Kashmir? What do you think? Do you think they're analogous? Do you think they're differences? What's your opinion on that?
The situation in Kashmir, I don't speak as an expert about Kashmir, so I can't claim to know all the intricacies. I mean, there's no doubt that the situation in Kashmir between India and Pakistan has been going for about the same time, in fact, as what's happening in Israel-Palestine. I guess the fundamental difference, though, is the way in which the Israel-Palestine conflict is framed internationally. The situation in Kashmir undoubtedly inspires anger, passion and violence. That's true, but nothing like Israel-Palestine. And you can't forget that in Israel and Palestine, the support for Israel by a Western major superpower is huge. I think when it comes to Kashmir, though, there is in the West fundamental misunderstanding. I think if you ask most people in most Western countries about Kashmir, if they've heard of it, and that's a big if, if you speak to a lot of Indians, they'll say that India is right. A lot of Pakistanis, of course, think that Pakistan is right. Like most of these kind of conflicts, I would argue, without international or outside influence, these things often don't get resolved. I'm not saying there should be a direction that, I mean, ultimately India and Pakistan have to resolve it themselves, and Kashmiris. But when something's been going on for so long and there are outside forces who are trying to cause trouble from both perspectives, to me it seems logical to try and get international support for a resolution. Of course, it also shows that the international system, as it is, routinely fails to resolve these things. And this has been going on for 60 years, 60 plus years. So ultimately I think it's a sense of, there are similarities between the two, and I think a lot of people feel justified in violence because of the feeling of occupation, the sense of occupation. And I think to not understand or appreciate that mistakes the reality of what occupation is. It doesn't justify killing a civilian, but it can explain it, and that's a case in Palestine too.
Right. When it comes to Palestine and Israel, there's a lot of talk, and a lot of the talk, the debate seems to revolve around the one-state solution, the two-state solution, the one-state solution, the two-state solution. Are these really the only two watertight compartments around? Are these only the options around? Do you see other?
The simple answer is there are alternatives, but what's happened in the last 20 years is that the Western elites have supposedly agreed that a two-state solution is the answer. That's come from the Americans, that's come from the EU, it's come from Australia, it's come from India. That's talked about, being the only answer. Of course, as I said before, the problem with that is that now increasingly with Israeli building of settlements, a two-state solution, a viable one, is impossible. You can't have that on the land where Palestinians are essentially colonised and can't live peacefully in their own land. Many people, and it's still on the margins, but increasingly common, believe in a binational state or a one-state solution. There is no logical reason why Jews, like any other people, should have privileges because they're Jewish over another people. That's essentially what Israel is, a democracy for Jews. And if you're a Palestinian in Israel proper or in the West Bank or Gaza, you are a second-class citizen. That is not a just solution. And a two-state solution arguably will only entrench that. A one-state solution at the moment is hard to see, but of course we shouldn't forget in some ways there's a one-state solution now. Israel controls everything. They control the roads, the water, the infrastructure, they build settlements. I think increasingly what will happen in the next years, if there's no political change, which I think is likely, what you'll see is a acceptance in the West that two-state solution is dead. There's only two alternatives, one-state solution or ongoing apartheid. And I fear that in the short term, apartheid is what's going to happen. There's no real pressure, and that's where a country like India, in my view, should be, if they were clever, should be far more supportive of the Palestinian position, because I fear that Israel and India are increasingly close because of arms, weapons. Israel has realised that the power of America is declining. And they're looking for friends elsewhere. China, India, happy to sell them weapons, happy to sell them arms, happy to support them. I don't think India as a country has the same emotional connection to Israel that America does, because of the Holocaust, because of the number of Jews. There aren't that many Jews in India, really. So the question really is, why would India support Israel apart from a financial reason or a real politique sense that it makes more sense for them to support Israel? So I would hope and encourage India to take a more enlightened view and be more supportive of the just position, which is of the Palestinians. If I had my choice, which of course I don't, about Indian foreign policy, that's what I would suggest.
That's what you would suggest. There was an attempt to arrest former Israeli Foreign Minister C.P. Livni in London for a role in the war against Gaza, a criminal role. She cancelled her trip, and before the court order could be executed. Do you see that happening against any other Israelis in key positions of power who were responsible for such war crimes?
It should. Whether it will, of course, I don't know. I think what's happening increasingly is there are a number of countries around the world, particularly in Europe, where senior former American officials or Israeli officials won't travel because they fear being arrested. The system of international justice is still incredibly basic, where in the West we're happy to say Milosevic in Yugoslavia was a tyrant, terrible man, dictator, Saddam Hussein, terrible man. And they were terrible people. But we still have not matured as an international community to say, in many ways, Western states have killed far more people than those in the third world. And if you look at, for example, the amount of people that were killed in Vietnam by the Americans, in Iraq, countless other countries. Not that we can base it solely on death toll, but if you look at it that way, America comes out on top, so does Britain for that matter. And there's pressure by Israel to change the law in Britain to allow people like Tzipi Livni and others to visit there without fear of arrest. Looks like the British government will change that law. But of course, increasingly, Western leaders like Tony Blair and George Bush and others should fear international justice because there's amazing amount of evidence that suggests that they've committed war crimes in numerous countries. So international justice needs to be for all, including white people. And it's hard not to sense that in the way that international justice now works, there's a silent racism going on that says that if you're brown or black, we're not that happy with that. If you're white, generally you're not going to be prosecuted, because that's the reality of what's happening now. White people don't get prosecuted for war crimes, generally. Or friends of the West, or friends of America, or friends of Britain. And that needs to change.
Right. Since we're talking about war crimes, the UN Richard Gladstone report, which looked into war crimes in Operation Cast Lead, this was rejected by both the US and Australia. Is there a whole you scratch my back, I scratch yours? Is that what's going on? What do you sense going on there? Why has this report been rejected? It's completely...
I think Goldstone's rejected for two reasons. One, because Israel is the golden child and can't do any wrong. Because of historical reasons, financial reasons, the Holocaust, the Israel lobby, many reasons. And secondly, I think what Goldstone essentially says makes America, Britain and Australia fear that there could be similar attempts at prosecution against them because of how they behaved in Iraq and Afghanistan. The deliberate targeting of civilians. There's countless evidence that suggests that Western forces in those countries and elsewhere target civilians on a regular basis and kill them, many of them, and injure them. So that the danger of Goldstone was the application of those findings in other theatres of war. Having said all that, despite the fact that Goldstone was smeared in his report, it still lives, it still continues. There is a fear that the Goldstone report is an important document, and we shouldn't forget that Goldstone himself was a South African Zionist Jew.
Exactly. Which is why it becomes even more important.
And more of a threat. And there was an attempt, as you will know, to try and smear him, demonise him, attack him, which didn't really work. I mean, he was shocked by that venom against him, but ultimately his report stands. There's been no prosecutions, and we live in hope that there will be. And there should be pressure on the Western world to prosecute Israeli officials who visit Western countries, including India, I might add.
So, you said that a military strike against Iran, you said in an earlier interview that I read, that a military strike against Iran would be silently cheered in parts of the Arab world, not by people but by political elites. What did you mean by that? Could you just explain it a bit, and which countries we're talking about?
In the WikiLeaks cables that came out the last couple of months, we saw that many Arab states, US-backed dictatorships, particularly Egypt, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, that Israel is friendly with as well, are concerned that Iran is on the rise. But we should be very clear what this is about. This is not really about a nuclear question. This is one of the great myths that goes on in the Western press. Most of the US and Israel and the Arab world don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. That's true. Although there's no evidence that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. There's no hard evidence, which people often forget when they report on this. The issue is Iran being a threat as a power in the Middle East, challenging American and Israeli hegemony in that region. And the irony is that the Iraq war, backed by the US, supported by Israel and the Arab states, has actually allowed Iran to become a regional power. So if tomorrow Israel or America bombs Iran, its nuclear sites, which I think is still not unlikely, it would be a disaster for obvious reasons. The Iraqi people, so the Iranian people, it would not bring down the regime. And I think what we've seen in Tunisia in the last few weeks shows the completely corrupt basis upon which Western foreign policy is centred in the Middle East. There is no evidence to suggest that America has ever backed democratic values in the Middle East, ever. They don't do it, they won't support it, it's a threat. And the truth is, if there were open and democratic elections in the Middle East tomorrow in every country, Islamist regimes would win. Anti-US, anti-American. And why do you think that would be? Because of how America has supported dictatorships for decades in that part of the world. So Iran, which is a brutal regime itself, I've spent time over there, it's not a pretty place, human rights are appalling. I'm not idealising Iran, but many people in the Arab world, the people support Ahmadinejad, not because they love him as a human being, because he stands up to America. He stands up to Israel. And he's become a hero, like Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, yes, ultimately I think a bombing attack against Iran is a threat, and again, India should play a role here by coming out very strongly and being opposed to that. I mean, India's a nuclear power too. And I just read a few days ago that there was I think your foreign minister was in Australia recently, asking Australia to sell uranium to India, which we refused to do, for reasons I won't bore you with, except to say that...
Actually, I would like to be bored by those reasons.
Okay. Well, the reason why Australia won't sell uranium, the current party in government, the Labor Party, won't sell uranium to
India.
Countries that haven't signed the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So India is seen as a friend of Australia. Well, I mean, Australia and India are very close, but there is a sense that, you know, we're not going to sell it to you unless you sign the dotted line.
Do that. Exactly.
Other administrations in Australia would have, but the current government won't. I don't think that's such a bad thing. I support that idea that countries should sign the NPT, because this also relates to Israel. Israel doesn't sign the NPT. It's on the nuclear issue, it's a rogue state that doesn't even acknowledge it has a nuclear capability. So, yeah, it seems, I think, as India grows as an international player, that it should choose to play a role which is often counter to the US rather than following the US. In the Middle East, it could play, as China could, a far more mature role, and that would mean not supporting dictatorships like Jordan, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and supporting the Palestinians against crimes that I suspect many in India are aware of, but makes them think about Kashmir.
Basically, the question is that in the countries that you spoke about, in countries where America has instituted dictatorships, do you think that there is a chance that in those countries there will be a revolt by the people, there will be Islamist power factions coming into power, and do you think that would lead, actually more than anything else, to a real war of civilizations?
Well, certainly the American government and Israel are petrified of democracy actually occurring in the Middle East. Democracy is a threat to what they've been doing for 60 years. It's a threat because, as I said, if the will of the people were given a chance to be heard, like we saw in Palestine a few years ago, Hamas won. Hamas's rule was never accepted, it's still not accepted. Gaza remains under siege, and the Tunisian uprising last week, in fact, has made a lot of the Arab world and America petrified. Because we're not quite sure how that country will play out, who knows, the situation is still very fluid. But ultimately, in countries like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and others, you have appallingly corrupt, brutal regimes that serve American and Israeli interests. That's how the Middle East works. And the people, for years, have expressed outrage with that. They've protested as much as they can. Whether there'll be revolutions, I don't know. I suspect that Tunisia is not seen as a major Middle East player. Egypt, Jordan and Saudi Arabia are. For energy reasons, position reasons, obviously oil, US bases, etc. It's hard to see that situation spiralling out of control that much, that the US, Israel would allow it to happen. And of course you have a situation therefore where the regimes themselves are simply there because America keeps them there. And the people in those countries are well aware of that. So the regimes themselves have no respect from their own people. And it seems that until those kind of regimes are washed away, people fear Islamism, they fear the concept of an Islamic state. And I'm not saying I welcome that, I'm simply saying that since 9/11, 10 years ago now roughly, there is a sense that anything which is an Islamic government, by definition, is a threat.
Right.
And there's all different sorts of Islamic governments. Saudi Arabia's an Islamic government, and that's a hideous regime.
Right.
And some Islamic governments, like in Turkey, are far more moderate. So it really depends how you define it. So until the West, I think, engages more the idea of political Islam, which they're going to have to do inevitably unless they want to live constantly at war, we have a problem. I don't really see much evidence of that happening because Israel firstly won't allow it, and I think America is happy to keep the status quo going. How long that can continue? Who knows?
On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.